In the 17th century, the life of a sailor aboard a Dutch East India Company, or VOC, ship was a daily struggle against not just the sea, but against time, circumstance, and the fragile human body. From the moment a sailor set foot on the deck, he entered a world governed by unpredictability, where each hour could bring both awe-inspiring beauty and terrifying danger. The ocean was both a lifeline and a threat. It provided the means to reach distant lands, to trade in valuable spices, silks, and precious commodities, but it also held the power to destroy everything within moments. Sailors understood that the waves they admired from a distance could just as easily engulf them, swallowing both men and ships without warning. Life aboard a VOC ship demanded constant vigilance, stamina, and a willingness to accept hardship as an inseparable companion of daily existence. The physical demands of this life were immense. Sailors were often roused before dawn, sometimes by the captain himself or by the sharp call of a boatswain, to begin an exhausting day of labor that could stretch from the early morning into the late evening. Hoisting the sails, a task that required the combined effort of multiple men, demanded not only strength but precise coordination. Each rope had to be pulled with skill. A misstep could lead to serious injury. Climbing the masts was particularly perilous. These towering structures swayed violently with the ship's motion, and the heights could terrify even the most seasoned sailor. Above, the sails flapped and whipped in the wind, threatening to throw any unwary man to the deck or into the churning sea. There was no room for hesitation. Indecision could be fatal, and yet exhaustion and the cold night air often dulled the reflexes and judgment of even the strongest crew members. The environment aboard the ship itself contributed to the peril. The decks were slippery from constant spray, the wood warped and weathered from decades of exposure to salt water. Storms were frequent and brutal. Tempestuous winds could arise without warning, whipping the waves into massive, rolling walls of water that crashed against the ship's hull. Sailors were expected to battle these conditions without complaint. They had to lash themselves with ropes to the ship when necessary, often working in teams to secure cargo, adjust sails, or bail out water that had seeped through cracks. The sea spray froze in winter months, coating ropes and rigging in ice that made every task more difficult and dangerous. Lightning storms turned the deck into a battlefield of sparks and thunderclaps, each one a reminder of the fragile boundary between life and death at sea. Even when storms were absent, the life of a sailor remained unforgiving. Long stretches of calm seas brought their own challenges. The relentless motion of the ship, even on a placid ocean, could induce chronic seasickness, draining energy and weakening the body over time. The physical labor required aboard the ship did not relent. Sailors scrubbed decks, repaired sails, and maintained equipment under the blazing sun, exposed to intense heat that could cause sunburn or heat stroke. At night, when the ship finally fell into relative silence, exhaustion was often the only companion, as there was little respite from the demands of the next day. Sleep, when it came, was irregular and broken, often shared with many other sailors in cramped, poorly ventilated quarters where disease could easily spread. The constant fatigue wore down both body and spirit, making every new challenge at sea all the more dangerous. In addition to the natural hazards of the sea, sailors faced dangers from the very structure of their ships. The VOC vessels were marvels of engineering for their time, yet they were not immune to the perils of long voyages. Leaks could develop in the hull, sometimes unnoticed until the water level rose dangerously. During storms, a ship could be thrown onto hidden reefs or rocks, tearing its wooden body apart and leaving sailors at the mercy of the sea. Equipment failures were common. ropes frayed, sails ripped, and rudders jammed. Sailors often had to perform repairs high above the deck, clinging to the rigging as the ship pitched and rolled, fully aware that a single misstep could result in death. Even experienced sailors could fall victim to these hazards, and the constant threat created an atmosphere of tension that never fully dissipated, even in calm weather. Human error, fatigue, and inexperience added another layer of danger. Many sailors aboard VOC ships were young men from rural areas who had never been to sea. Their lack of experience often meant mistakes, sometimes small, sometimes fatal. Senior sailors and officers had to constantly monitor these men, correcting errors, enforcing discipline, and preventing accidents. However, the hierarchy aboard the ship could create friction. Punishments for mistakes were severe, and the fear of reprimand could sometimes impair judgment rather than improve it. Tensions could flare between crew members, and in the confined space of a ship at sea, even minor disputes could escalate into serious conflicts, distracting sailors from the essential tasks that kept the ship afloat. Disease was another silent but ever-present danger that compounded the perils of life at sea. Scurvy, caused by a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, weakened sailors' bodies, leaving them prone to fatigue, bleeding gums, and infections. Dysentery and typhus spread quickly through the crowded living quarters, especially when the ship's provisions became contaminated or water supplies turned stagnant. In an environment where medical knowledge was limited and conditions were harsh, illness could strike multiple men at once, leaving the crew short-handed and the ship vulnerable to accidents. A single sailor, incapacitated by sickness, could mean additional labor for others, increasing the risk of injury, and in extreme cases, entire voyages were compromised by widespread illness. The mental and emotional strain of this life cannot be underestimated. Isolation on the open sea for months at a time tested the resilience of even the hardiest sailors. The vastness of the ocean, with no land in sight for weeks or months, could create feelings of fear, helplessness, and despair. Sailors had to contend with the constant awareness that rescue was unlikely in the event of an accident, the knowledge that death could arrive in an instant, whether from drowning, storm, disease, or injury, weighed heavily on their minds. Some sailors turned to camaraderie, sharing stories and rituals to maintain morale, while others struggled with anxiety, homesickness, or despair. This psychological pressure was as dangerous as any storm or disease, affecting judgment, reaction times, and overall safety aboard the ship. Moreover, the voyage itself was filled with inherent dangers of navigation. Without modern technology, sailors relied on rudimentary maps, compasses, and celestial navigation. Miscalculations could lead the ship off course, into uncharted waters, or onto deadly reefs. Crossing unfamiliar seas meant encountering unpredictable weather patterns, currents, and tides. These navigational hazards were compounded by the sheer length of VOC voyages, which often lasted several months or more. Every day spent at sea brought the potential for disaster, and sailors learned to live with the constant tension of knowing that one misstep in judgment could end their lives. Violence and mutiny were further dangers that loomed over life aboard VOC ships. Sailors were constantly under the authority of captains and officers who maintained strict discipline through physical punishment, fines, or public humiliation. While necessary to maintain order, this system of control could spark resentment. In extreme cases, tensions between sailors and officers erupted into mutiny, a deadly prospect on the open sea. Sailors had to balance obedience with self-preservation, navigating a social hierarchy that could be as dangerous as the sea itself. Fear Fatigue and frustration were constant companions, intensifying the physical and mental challenges of life aboard ship. Despite these dangers, sailors were driven by necessity, ambition, and sometimes desperation. The rewards for surviving the perils of the sea could be substantial: trade opportunities, steady wages, adventure, and the possibility of advancement. However, these incentives never erased the risks. Every wave, every rope, every storm reminded sailors that life at sea was precarious. They existed in a fragile balance where skill, vigilance, and endurance could mean the difference between life and death. The perilous life of a VOC sailor was defined not only by the external threats of nature and circumstance, but also by the internal struggle to remain strong, alert, and hopeful in a world dominated by unpredictability. Ultimately, the life of a Dutch VOC sailor in the 17th century was one of constant vigilance, extraordinary labor, and relentless danger. It demanded courage, resilience, and a willingness to endure hardship that few on land could comprehend. From battling storms to preventing accidents, from overcoming disease to navigating uncharted waters, every day presented new challenges. It was a life that combined awe-inspiring adventure with life-threatening risk, a life where survival was never guaranteed, and where the ocean's beauty was inseparable from its peril. The stories of these sailors are a testament to human endurance, courage, and the will to survive in one of history's most dangerous professions, offering us a window into a world where danger and discovery existed hand in hand. Life aboard a Dutch VOC ship in the 17th century was not only physically grueling, but also governed by a strict and often brutal system of discipline. Sailors were expected to obey orders without question, perform their duties with precision, and maintain the hierarchy imposed by officers and captains, or face severe consequences. The authority of the captain was absolute, and every member of the crew was subject to rules designed to ensure the ship functioned smoothly and reached its destination safely. In an environment as dangerous and unpredictable as the open ocean, discipline was not a suggestion, but a necessity. However, necessity often came with cruelty, and the enforcement of rules could transform everyday life into a constant test of endurance, courage, and obedience. The sailor's world was one where fear, respect, and survival were deeply intertwined, creating an atmosphere of tension and vigilance that never fully dissipated. The hierarchy aboard a VOC ship was rigid and meticulously maintained. At the top was the captain, whose authority extended to life and death decisions aboard the vessel. Beneath him were the officers, including the first mate, second mate, and other specialized positions, who were responsible for overseeing specific areas of the ship and enforcing the captain's orders. Ordinary sailors, often young men with little experience at sea, were at the bottom of this hierarchy and bore the brunt of the discipline. They were expected to perform backbreaking labor, follow orders precisely, and endure both physical and psychological stress with minimal complaint. Mistakes, whether accidental or perceived as negligence, were rarely tolerated, and the consequences could be immediate and severe. Punishments aboard the ships were often public, serving not only as retribution, but also as a deterrent to others. The threat of corporal punishment, such as flogging with ropes or the cat-o'-nine tails, was ever present. A sailor might be tied to a post and whipped for failing to follow orders, for insubordination, or for mishandling equipment. The pain inflicted was intense, but the humiliation of the punishment, witnessed by the entire crew, was equally significant. The purpose was to reinforce the authority of the officers and instill a sense of fear that would prevent future mistakes. Sailors quickly learned that survival depended not only on skill and endurance, but also on strict adherence to the chain of command and an ability to endure suffering without protest. The enforcement of discipline extended beyond physical punishment. Sailors could be subjected to restrictions such as confinement to the ship's hold or reduced rations, which added to the mental and emotional strain of life at sea. These penalties were designed to emphasize obedience and compliance, often for relatively minor infractions. In a world where the margin for error was already perilously thin, even small mistakes could be magnified through harsh punishment. Sailors had to navigate a delicate balance between performing their duties efficiently and avoiding the wrath of their superiors, understanding that any lapse could lead to suffering or even death. One of the most striking aspects of VOC discipline was its combination of severity and constant surveillance. Officers maintained a watchful eye over the crew at all times, monitoring not only work performance, but also behavior, demeanor, and interactions among sailors. Any hint of insubordination, laziness, or disobedience could trigger immediate consequences. Sailors were aware that there was no escape from scrutiny, and the knowledge that punishment could strike at any moment created a pervasive atmosphere of tension. This constant oversight, coupled with the ever-present dangers of the sea, made life aboard the ship psychologically taxing, requiring both mental fortitude and adaptability. Mutiny, though rare, was a constant underlying concern for officers, and the strict discipline was in part a preventative measure. The cramped quarters, grueling labor, and extended periods at sea created conditions in which resentment could easily grow among sailors. The officers' harsh methods were intended to suppress dissent and maintain order, ensuring that the ship remained a cohesive unit capable of navigating treacherous waters and surviving storms, disease, and other hazards. While extreme measures might appear cruel by modern standards, they were considered necessary in an era when a single act of defiance could endanger the entire crew and jeopardize valuable cargo. The psychological effects of this strict discipline were profound. Sailors lived in a state of constant alertness, acutely aware of the consequences of failure. Fear was a daily companion, shaping behavior and influencing every decision. At the same time, discipline instilled a sense of order, structure, and predictability in a world dominated by chaos. It reinforced the hierarchy that allowed the ship to function as a complex machine, ensuring that each sailor understood his role and responsibilities. Yet the emotional toll of living under such conditions was significant, often manifesting in stress, anxiety, and a sense of isolation, as sailors struggled to reconcile obedience with their own survival instincts and personal ambitions. Physical punishment was not the only method of enforcing discipline. Verbal reprimands and humiliation were equally effective tools. Officers would publicly scold sailors for mistakes, berating them in front of their peers to reinforce authority and shame the individual. This form of psychological punishment was particularly powerful in the tightly knit social environment of the ship, where reputation and respect were critical to survival. Sailors learned quickly that maintaining composure, showing deference, and performing duties without error were essential to avoid both humiliation and physical suffering. The consequences of disobedience could extend far beyond the immediate punishment. Sailors who gained a reputation for defiance or incompetence risked being marginalized within the crew, assigned the most dangerous or exhausting tasks, or denied opportunities for advancement. In extreme cases, continued insubordination could result in execution or abandonment in hostile territories. The combination of fear, respect, and survival instincts shaped the behavior of every sailor, influencing interactions, decision-making, and morale. Despite the severity of discipline, many sailors developed coping mechanisms to endure the harsh conditions. Camaraderie among the crew provided some relief from the constant pressure, as shared hardships created bonds that could mitigate the isolation and fear imposed by authority. Humor, storytelling, and ritualized behaviors became tools for psychological survival, allowing sailors to navigate the tension between obedience and personal resilience. Even as they endured harsh punishments, many sailors found ways to maintain morale, relying on one another to survive both the physical and emotional challenges of life at sea. Strict discipline also had practical benefits for the ship's operations. The coordination required to sail a VOC vessel, particularly during storms or complex maneuvers, depended on precise execution of orders. A single mistake could compromise the ship's stability, endanger lives, or result in the loss of valuable cargo. By enforcing rigorous discipline, officers ensured that the crew worked as a cohesive unit, capable of responding to emergencies, navigating treacherous waters, and performing complex tasks with minimal error. In this sense, the harsh measures, while difficult to endure, were instrumental in the survival and success of the voyage. However, the tension between necessity and cruelty was a constant theme in the lives of VOC sailors. Many endured punishment not out of malice, but as part of a system designed to maintain order in a hazardous environment. Yet the human cost was high, with injuries, trauma, and fear shaping the daily experience of every crew member. The memory of punishment lingered long after the incident, influencing behavior, relationships, and mental health. Sailors learned to anticipate consequences, to act with caution, and to navigate a social and professional environment that was as challenging as the sea itself. The relationship between sailors and officers was complex, defined by both authority and interdependence. Officers relied on the labor, skill, and endurance of the crew to maintain the ship, while sailors depended on the officers for direction, protection, and the possibility of reward. Discipline served as the binding force in this relationship, creating a system in which obedience was both demanded and incentivized. Sailors who performed well, followed orders, and maintained composure often received privileges, better assignments, or opportunities for advancement, while those who faltered faced punishment and marginalization. This dynamic created a constant interplay of fear, respect, and ambition, shaping the social and operational life of the ship. The legacy of strict discipline aboard VOC ships extends beyond historical curiosity. It illustrates the extreme measures humans have employed to survive in environments dominated by danger and uncertainty. The sailors' resilience in the face of harsh punishment, combined with their ability to perform demanding tasks under constant threat, offers insight into human endurance, adaptability, and the psychological strategies that enabled survival in one of history's most hazardous professions. Life under such conditions required not only physical strength but mental fortitude, the ability to navigate fear, and the capacity to maintain cohesion within a system that balanced authority, control, and survival. In conclusion, the strict discipline and harsh punishment that characterized life aboard a Dutch VOC ship were integral to the functioning of these maritime enterprises. They ensured obedience, maintained order, and mitigated the risks inherent in long voyages across dangerous seas. At the same time, they imposed significant psychological and physical burdens on the sailors, shaping their behavior, relationships, and experience of life at sea. Fear, respect, endurance, and resilience became the hallmarks of a sailor's existence, reflecting both the necessity and the human cost of maintaining order in a world defined by danger, uncertainty, and the relentless demands of survival. The sailor's ability to endure such conditions is a testament to the extraordinary resilience and adaptability of humans when confronted with relentless hardship, illustrating the complex interplay of authority, obedience, and survival in one of history's most perilous professions. Life aboard a Dutch VOC ship in the 17th century was not only physically exhausting and mentally demanding, but it was also fraught with invisible dangers that struck indiscriminately: disease and malnutrition. While storms, rough seas, and accidents were obvious threats, the silent assault of illness and lack of proper nutrition could be just as deadly, claiming lives slowly and relentlessly over the course of long voyages. For sailors, the months at sea meant exposure to conditions that their bodies were not naturally prepared to withstand, and the combination of limited supplies, poor hygiene, and extended confinement created a breeding ground for sickness. The human body, already taxed by exhausting labor, exposure to cold or tropical heat, and inadequate rest, was constantly at risk. Disease and malnutrition shaped the daily lives, actions, and decisions of sailors in ways that were often inescapable and devastating. One of the most notorious ailments aboard VOC ships was scurvy, a disease caused by a deficiency of vitamin C. The sailors' diet primarily consisted of salted meat, hardtack, dried legumes, and occasionally dried fish. Fresh fruits and vegetables, which could have prevented scurvy, were nearly impossible to store for the long months of the voyage. As a result, sailors' bodies gradually weakened. Early symptoms included fatigue, weakness, and irritability, followed by swelling in the limbs, bleeding gums, and severe joint pain. Over time, untreated scurvy could lead to open wounds, tooth loss, and eventually death. The progression of the disease was slow but inexorable, a creeping destruction of the body that left sailors increasingly incapable of performing the strenuous work required aboard ship. For a sailor, each day became a battle not only against the elements and the ship's labor, but against the very failure of his own body. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal illnesses were common and equally lethal. Contaminated water, spoiled provisions, and cramped, unsanitary living conditions turned the ship into a breeding ground for infection. Sailors frequently suffered from diarrhea, dehydration, fever, and intense pain, often compounded by malnutrition. These conditions could strike suddenly, incapacitating men in their duties and placing additional strain on their crewmates, who were required to maintain operations in their absence. The unpredictability of such illness added another layer of fear and stress, as sailors had no way to anticipate when the next outbreak might occur, nor did they have access to effective treatments or medicines. The ship's doctor, often an untrained individual or a surgeon with limited knowledge, could provide only rudimentary care, leaving many to suffer through disease with minimal assistance. Typhus, a highly contagious bacterial infection, spread rapidly among sailors living in close quarters. Fleas, lice, and poor sanitation contributed to its prevalence, and outbreaks could decimate a crew in a matter of days or weeks. Symptoms included high fever, chills, headaches, and a characteristic rash, often leading to delirium or death if left untreated. The confined environment of the ship meant that once the disease appeared, it was nearly impossible to contain, and healthy sailors were at constant risk of infection. The psychological impact of witnessing fellow crew members succumb to disease was profound, amplifying the stress, anxiety, and fear that already pervaded life at sea. Each day became a negotiation with mortality, as sailors were forced to continue their work while knowing that illness could strike at any moment. Malnutrition compounded the risks of disease and weakened sailors' immune systems, making them more susceptible to infection and injury. The lack of fresh food meant that sailors were dependent on preserved staples, which provided calories but lacked essential nutrients. Hardtack, a dry and brittle biscuit, often became infested with weevils or mold, adding another source of discomfort and potential illness. Salted meat, though preserved for months, was tough, rancid, and deficient in necessary vitamins. The monotony of the diet, combined with scarcity of fresh provisions, led to gradual deterioration of physical health. Sailors lost weight, became easily fatigued, and were more prone to accidents because their bodies could no longer cope with the relentless physical demands of hoisting sails, swabbing decks, and climbing masts. Hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing reminder of the precariousness of life aboard ship, and a source of tension and despair among the crew. The impact of malnutrition extended beyond physical weakness. Cognitive function, mood, and morale were all affected by prolonged dietary deficiency. Sailors suffered from irritability, depression, and a sense of hopelessness, all of which undermined cooperation and performance aboard ship. In a high-risk environment where teamwork was essential, these psychological consequences could have deadly consequences. Miscommunication, mistakes, or delays in responding to orders could result in accidents, injuries, or worse, the loss of the ship. The interplay between nutrition, mental resilience, and physical endurance created a delicate balance in which any weakness could jeopardize survival, making each sailor acutely aware of the importance of maintaining health despite limited resources. Access to clean water was another constant struggle. Freshwater supplies were limited, and over the course of months, barrels often became contaminated or stagnant. Sailors were forced to ration water, sometimes supplementing it with beer or other alcoholic beverages, which could provide calories but did little to prevent dehydration. The lack of sufficient hydration compounded the effects of malnutrition and disease, making sailors more vulnerable to heat stroke, fatigue, and infection. Water management became a crucial part of daily life aboard ship, and errors in rationing could have immediate and severe consequences, adding yet another layer of stress to an already demanding existence. The cramped living conditions aboard VOC ships intensified the impact of disease and malnutrition. Sailors were packed into small, poorly ventilated quarters, where hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. Sweat, smoke, and the stench of unwashed bodies combined to create an environment that facilitated the spread of illness. Infestations of lice, fleas, and other pests were common, further exposing sailors to disease. In these conditions, even minor injuries could become infected, and the lack of medical knowledge or supplies meant that simple ailments could quickly escalate into life-threatening conditions. The close quarters also meant that there was little privacy, little respite from the sight of fellow sailors suffering, and little opportunity to recover in solitude. Every cough, fever, or complaint served as a reminder of the ever-present threat of illness. Medical treatment on VOC ships was rudimentary at best. Surgeons often relied on primitive techniques, herbs, or bleeding to treat ailments, with little understanding of sanitation or infection. Medicines were scarce and largely ineffective for serious conditions. Sailors had to rely on personal resilience and the limited support of the ship's crew to endure illness. In many cases, the best strategy was prevention, careful rationing of food, attempts to maintain hygiene, and adherence to routine. Yet even with vigilance, disease and malnutrition were relentless adversaries, striking down the strongest and most capable men without warning. Survival often depended on a combination of luck, stamina, and the sheer will to endure hardship over months of exposure to these harsh conditions. The psychological toll of disease and malnutrition was profound. Sailors witnessed the slow deterioration of their comrades, experiencing grief, fear, and anxiety in the confined environment of the ship. The knowledge that any crew member, including oneself, could succumb at any time created a pervasive atmosphere of tension and dread. Sailors developed coping mechanisms, relying on camaraderie, humor, and rituals to maintain morale. However, these strategies could only partially mitigate the constant awareness of vulnerability and mortality. The mental resilience required to continue performing dangerous tasks under such conditions was immense, as sailors had to suppress fear while remaining vigilant and alert, knowing that even a minor lapse could be fatal. Disease and malnutrition also influenced the social dynamics aboard the ship. Sailors who were weaker or sickly were often marginalized or assigned the most menial and hazardous tasks. Competition for limited provisions could create tension and conflict, while those who were ill became dependent on the assistance of others, fostering both solidarity and resentment. The shared struggle against hunger and sickness bonded some, while exposing weaknesses in cooperation and morale for others. Navigating these social challenges required both tact and endurance, as sailors had to balance self-preservation with the demands of communal survival. The dangers of disease and malnutrition were further compounded during long voyages through unfamiliar climates. Tropical regions exposed sailors to diseases such as malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever, which could decimate crews unaccustomed to local pathogens. The heat, humidity, and exposure to insects added additional strain on already weakened bodies. Sailors returning from the tropics often carried illnesses back to Europe, and ships served as vectors for the transmission of disease over long distances. The risk of encountering these health hazards was a constant factor in planning and executing voyages, shaping the timing, route, and provisioning of ships. Ultimately, the threat of disease and malnutrition shaped every aspect of life aboard a VOC ship. Sailors had to endure not only the physical demands of labor and the psychological pressures of hierarchy and discipline, but also the relentless assault of illness and hunger. Survival depended on resilience, vigilance, and adaptability, as well as on cooperation among crew members. The experience of disease and malnutrition was a defining element of the sailor's existence, influencing behavior, morale, and the outcome of voyages. It was a slow, insidious danger, often more deadly than storms, accidents, or even enemy attacks, and it demanded constant attention, resourcefulness, and fortitude. The legacy of this experience is a testament to human endurance under extreme conditions. VOC sailors survived in environments that would overwhelm most, demonstrating remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and courage. They adapted to the harsh realities of life at sea, developing strategies to manage nutrition, maintain hygiene, and support one another in the face of adversity. The combination of disease, malnutrition, and the demands of maritime labor created one of history's most challenging and perilous professions, shaping the character, skills, and mentality of those who undertook it. The ability to endure months of limited food, exposure to disease, and the ever-present threat of mortality is a testament to human fortitude and adaptability, revealing the extraordinary lengths to which individuals could push themselves to survive in a world dominated by the forces of nature and circumstance. In conclusion, the intertwined challenges of disease and malnutrition were central to the lived experience of VOC sailors. They were invisible enemies, striking relentlessly and indiscriminately, shaping the physical, mental, and social dimensions of life aboard ship. Scurvy, dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses claimed countless lives, while malnutrition weakened the body and mind, increasing vulnerability to accidents and infection. Sailors faced these threats with courage, endurance, and ingenuity, relying on their own resilience and the support of their comrades to survive. Their experiences offer a vivid window into the harsh realities of life at sea in the 17th century, highlighting the extraordinary human capacity to endure suffering and persevere in the face of relentless danger, where every day was a struggle against both the visible and invisible forces that governed their lives. Life aboard a Dutch VOC ship in the 17th century was perilous not only because of the harsh seas, disease, and malnutrition, but also due to the constant threat of conflict. The VOC, or Dutch East India Company, was a powerful trading enterprise that operated across vast stretches of ocean, navigating not only the treacherous waters of the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans, but also the complex and often dangerous relationships with other European powers, pirates, and local populations. For sailors, this meant that every voyage carried the risk of violent confrontation, whether from hostile ships, marauders, or even their own comrades. The potential for conflict influenced every aspect of life aboard the ship, shaping daily routines, training, social dynamics, and psychological resilience. Sailors were acutely aware that the ocean was not an empty expanse, but a contested space. The VOC ships, while built for trade, were also armed for protection. Cannons, muskets, and other weaponry were standard equipment, and sailors were expected to be proficient in their use. This dual role of sailor and soldier required constant vigilance and preparation. From the earliest days of training aboard the ship, men were instructed in both navigation and combat. They practiced loading and firing cannons, boarding maneuvers, and repelling attacks. These drills were not merely formalities. They were essential for survival, as encounters with pirates, rival European powers, or hostile locals were common and could escalate to deadly violence within moments. Piracy was a significant threat during VOC voyages. Pirates operated throughout the Indian Ocean, the Strait of Malacca, and along various trading routes, preying on merchant ships laden with valuable cargo. The VOC sailors were aware that a single pirate attack could mean the loss of the ship, treasure, and lives. Pirates were often well-armed and ruthless, attacking with speed and precision. Sailors had to be constantly prepared, maintaining readiness even during long stretches of calm seas. The threat of piracy imposed a psychological burden, as vigilance could never be fully relaxed. The sound of approaching sails, the appearance of distant ships on the horizon, or even unusual movements in the water could trigger tension, fear, and immediate action, keeping sailors in a constant state of alertness. Rival European powers also posed a serious risk. The 17th century was marked by intense competition for control over trade routes, colonies, and resources. The Portuguese, English, and later the French all sought to dominate the lucrative spice trade in the East Indies, often leading to naval skirmishes and full-scale battles. VOC sailors, therefore, needed to be trained not only in sailing, but in naval tactics and combat strategy. They had to understand the capabilities of their own ship and armament, anticipate the movements of enemy vessels, and act quickly under pressure. A single error in judgment could result in the destruction of the ship, the capture of the crew, or death in battle. This constant awareness of potential confrontation shaped the culture aboard the ship, reinforcing discipline, hierarchy, and the importance of obedience to orders. Local conflicts also contributed to the ever-present threat of violence. As VOC ships traveled to ports in the East Indies, they encountered indigenous populations with whom trade agreements had to be carefully negotiated. While some interactions were peaceful and mutually beneficial, others were fraught with tension. Misunderstandings, disputes over trade terms, or perceived slights could quickly escalate into armed conflict. Sailors were sometimes required to participate in landing parties, protect the ship, or engage in combat on unfamiliar shores. These excursions added another layer of risk, exposing men to disease, unfamiliar terrain, and the possibility of ambush. The unpredictability of these encounters demanded adaptability, courage, and constant vigilance, as even a routine trading mission could become deadly. The nature of conflict at sea required sailors to develop both physical and mental resilience. Combat situations were chaotic, loud, and terrifying, often involving the simultaneous threats of enemy fire aboard their own vessel, and the movement of the ship itself. Sailors had to act decisively while under immense stress, coordinating with their comrades to load cannons, repel boarders, or perform damage control. The presence of sharp metal, gunpowder, and open flames made every action potentially fatal. The stakes were high. One misstep could injure or kill not only the sailor, but also his shipmates. Mental fortitude was as critical as physical skill, as panic could spread quickly among the crew, undermining cohesion and endangering everyone aboard. Boarding actions were a particularly dangerous aspect of maritime conflict. Sailors could be ordered to climb onto enemy vessels to seize control, a task that demanded courage, strength, and coordination. The chaos of close quarters combat, often with swords, pikes, and firearms, was brutal. Bloodshed was common, and injuries could be severe or fatal. The psychological impact of participating in such violence was profound, leaving sailors with lasting trauma even after the battle had ended. Yet these actions were sometimes necessary to secure the ship's cargo, protect the crew, or fulfill the company's strategic objectives. The ability to engage in combat effectively while maintaining composure and discipline was essential for survival. Even within the ship, conflict could arise among the crew. The stressful, dangerous, and cramped conditions created tension, competition, and occasional violence. Disputes over rations, sleeping arrangements, or perceived favoritism by officers could escalate into fights. Sailors needed to navigate these social dynamics carefully, balancing self-preservation with the necessity of maintaining relationships and cooperation. A violent altercation could distract from critical tasks, compromise the ship's operation, and even escalate into mutiny if not managed by officers. Understanding both external and internal threats was therefore a crucial aspect of life at sea. The unpredictability of the ocean itself amplified the danger of conflict. Storms, high waves, and shifting winds could occur simultaneously with an attack, complicating combat efforts. Sailors had to manage their ship's sails, maneuver through treacherous waters, and maintain defensive readiness all at once. A storm could turn a routine battle into a struggle for survival, forcing sailors to make split-second decisions under extreme physical and psychological stress. Their training, endurance, and ability to work as a coordinated team determined not only the outcome of the conflict, but also whether they would survive the voyage at all. Weapons and artillery were central to the sailors' preparation for conflict. Cannons required careful maintenance, precise loading, and accurate aiming. Sailors were drilled in their use repeatedly, as errors could result in misfires, explosions, or friendly fire. Muskets, swords, and pikes were equally dangerous if mishandled, and accidents were common during both training and actual combat. The combination of inexperience, fear, and physical exhaustion made handling these weapons a continuous challenge, requiring constant attention and discipline. The presence of such weaponry, while necessary for defense, added an omnipresent sense of danger to life aboard the ship, as even routine tasks could lead to injury or death. The psychological burden of potential conflict was immense. Sailors lived with the knowledge that danger could strike at any moment, whether from pirates, rival powers, or hostile locals. Sleep was often interrupted by alarms or unexpected developments, and periods of calm were filled with tension and anticipation. The stress of constant vigilance, combined with the harsh physical demands of the voyage, created a mentally taxing environment. Sailors needed resilience, adaptability, and focus to maintain their performance and survival, and failure to manage these pressures could have deadly consequences. Strategic thinking and anticipation were essential skills. Sailors had to understand not only the capabilities of their own ship, but also the intentions, strengths, and weaknesses of potential adversaries. They needed to anticipate attacks, adjust sails for optimal positioning, and coordinate maneuvers with their comrades under the captain's orders. Effective communication, trust, and discipline within the crew were vital for responding to conflict successfully. The success or failure of the ship in combat depended on the ability of each sailor to act decisively, efficiently, and in concert with others, often under extreme stress and threat of injury or death. The threat of conflict also shaped the broader culture aboard VOC ships. Obedience, loyalty, and courage were highly valued traits, and those who demonstrated skill and composure in combat were respected and often rewarded. Conversely, fear, hesitation, or perceived cowardice could lead to scorn, punishment, or marginalization. The knowledge that life depended on collective effort fostered a complex social dynamic, blending fear, camaraderie, and mutual reliance. Sailors learned to trust their shipmates, as the failure of one individual could jeopardize the safety of all. Even after battles ended, the consequences of conflict lingered. Wounded sailors required care, the ship might be damaged, and psychological scars endured long after the immediate threat had passed. Disease and malnutrition compounded these challenges, as recovery was slow and resources limited. The experience of surviving violent encounters shaped sailors' attitudes, relationships, and strategies for managing risk. Each encounter with danger reinforced the importance of vigilance, training, and cooperation, while also serving as a reminder of the fragility of life at sea. Ultimately, the threat of conflict was a constant and defining aspect of life aboard VOC ships. Sailors had to navigate external dangers from pirates, rival powers, and hostile locals, while managing internal tensions, physical exhaustion, and the unpredictability of the ocean itself. The combination of preparation, training, courage, and adaptability determined whether a sailor survived or perished. Every action, from loading a cannon to climbing a mast, was influenced by the potential for violence, shaping behavior, social dynamics, and mental resilience. The omnipresent risk of conflict demanded skill, endurance, and a profound understanding of both human nature and the sea, making the life of a VOC sailor one of the most dangerous and complex experiences of the early modern period. In conclusion, the threat of conflict aboard Dutch VOC ships permeated every aspect of the sailors' lives. It was not limited to the moment of battle, but shaped daily routines, social interactions, training, and psychological endurance. Pirates, rival powers, and local hostilities combined with the challenges of navigation, storms, and disease to create an environment in which survival depended on vigilance, skill, and cooperation. Sailors faced the constant knowledge that danger could strike at any moment, and their ability to endure, adapt, and act decisively was critical to their survival. The threat of conflict was therefore a defining feature of life at sea, shaping the experiences, behavior, and legacy of those who navigated the perilous waters of the 17th century maritime world. Life aboard a Dutch VOC ship in the 17th century was shaped not only by storms, disease, and conflict, but also by a rigid hierarchical structure that governed every aspect of daily life. The hierarchy aboard these ships was meticulously maintained, and understanding one's place within it was essential for survival. From the captain at the top to the low-ranked sailor, every individual had clearly defined responsibilities, privileges, and expectations. The structure was designed to ensure efficiency, discipline, and order, particularly given the dangerous and unpredictable conditions at sea. Obedience was not optional, it was a requirement. At the same time, the hierarchy created both tension and dependency among the crew, shaping social interactions, psychological dynamics, and the overall functioning of the ship. At the apex of the hierarchy was the captain, whose authority was virtually absolute. He was responsible for navigation, the safety of the ship and crew, discipline, and the management of cargo. Decisions made by the captain could determine the success or failure of a voyage, and even minor errors could have catastrophic consequences. His word was law aboard the vessel, and he relied on a combination of skill, experience, and strict enforcement of rules to maintain control. The captain's authority extended beyond technical decision-making to matters of life and death, including the imposition of punishment for breaches of discipline or acts of insubordination. For the sailors, the captain represented both protection and threat. He was the arbiter of their daily existence, capable of providing opportunities for advancement or imposing harsh penalties for misbehavior. Beneath the captain were the officers, including the first mate, second mate, and specialized positions such as the boatswain, carpenter, and gunner. These men formed an essential link between the captain and the crew. They were tasked with translating the captain's orders into actionable work, maintaining discipline, and supervising specific operations aboard the ship. Officers were often experienced sailors who had risen through the ranks, and their authority was both respected and feared. The officers were responsible for overseeing everything from navigation and sail management to weaponry and cargo security. Their ability to command respect and enforce orders was crucial, as a breakdown in authority could result in chaos, accidents, or even mutiny. For ordinary sailors, the officers represented immediate authority figures, a constant presence, whose observation and judgment influenced every action, from the simplest task to the most complex operation. Ordinary sailors occupied the lowest rung of the hierarchy and bore the heaviest physical burdens. These men performed back-breaking labor, from hoisting sails and scrubbing decks to managing cargo and assisting in maintenance tasks. They were expected to follow orders without hesitation and were constantly monitored for efficiency and compliance. Mistakes could result in punishment, reassignment to more dangerous duties, or public humiliation. Life for ordinary sailors was characterized by long hours, physical strain, and limited personal freedom. Their position in the hierarchy demanded endurance, obedience, and a keen awareness of both the expectations placed upon them and the consequences of failure. The hierarchy aboard VOC ships was reinforced through strict discipline and social customs. Authority was demonstrated and maintained through a combination of formal regulations, rituals, and the visible display of power. Sailors were required to respond to orders promptly, use formal language when addressing officers, and demonstrate deference in both speech and behavior. Uniforms, badges, and specific roles reinforced the social order, making clear who held authority and who was subordinate. Deviations from these expectations were not only socially unacceptable, but could also trigger punishment, creating an environment in which awareness of one's position in the hierarchy was a constant necessity. The division of labor aboard the ship was a reflection of the hierarchical structure. Officers and specialized personnel were responsible for complex tasks requiring skill and judgment, such as navigation, cannon operation, or carpentry. Ordinary sailors performed tasks that demanded physical strength and endurance, but required less specialized knowledge. This division ensured that each individual contributed to the functioning of the ship according to their abilities, while also reinforcing social stratification. Sailors understood that advancement within the hierarchy was possible but difficult, often requiring exceptional skill, bravery, or loyalty. Ambition could motivate individuals to excel, but it also risked drawing attention and scrutiny as officers closely monitored behavior and performance. Hierarchy also dictated access to resources and privileges aboard the ship. Officers had better living quarters, higher quality food, and greater authority in decision-making. Ordinary sailors often lived in cramped, dark, and poorly ventilated spaces with limited rations and minimal comfort. These disparities reinforced social divisions and created tension, but they also served practical purposes. Those in positions of authority were better nourished, rested, and equipped to make decisions that affected the entire crew, while the laboring sailor's energy was devoted to sustaining the ship's operations. The hierarchy was thus both a social and functional framework, ensuring the efficiency and survival of the vessel while maintaining clear boundaries of power. Punishment and reward were integral to maintaining the hierarchy. Officers could mete out consequences for disobedience, negligence, or insubordination, ranging from verbal reprimands to corporal punishment or reassignment to hazardous duties. Conversely, exceptional performance, loyalty, or bravery could result in recognition, small privileges, or even promotion. This system reinforced the authority of the hierarchy while motivating sailors to adhere to expectations. The constant awareness of potential punishment shaped behavior, instilling a sense of fear, caution, and respect, while the possibility of reward encouraged diligence, skill development, and loyalty. The delicate balance between discipline and incentive was critical for maintaining order aboard a vessel where the cost of error was extraordinarily high. The hierarchy extended to social relationships among the crew. Sailors' interactions were governed by their relative positions, creating a complex web of authority, deference, rivalry, and camaraderie. Officers maintained authority not only through formal power, but also through personal conduct, reputation, and leadership skills. Sailors navigated these dynamics carefully, learning when to defer, when to act independently, and when to challenge or cooperate. Trust and cooperation were essential, as failure by one individual could endanger everyone aboard. The hierarchical structure thus shaped both formal and informal social behaviors, influencing alliances, conflicts, and the overall cohesion of the crew. Training and experience reinforced the hierarchy. Ordinary sailors often started at the bottom with little knowledge of seamanship, learning through observation, repetition, and correction from more experienced crew members and officers. Over time, a sailor could rise through the ranks, gaining responsibility, skill, and social standing. Promotions were based on merit, endurance, and loyalty, but the process was slow and fraught with challenges. Advancement offered not only increased privileges, but also greater authority and influence, reinforcing the central role of hierarchy in shaping ambition, performance, and social dynamics aboard the ship. The hierarchical structure also influenced how sailors coped with danger, adversity, and uncertainty. In an environment dominated by storms, disease, and conflict, clear lines of authority provided guidance, organization, and coordination. Sailors knew whom to follow in emergencies, who to trust with critical tasks, and how to navigate challenges with minimal confusion. While the hierarchy could create tension, resentment, or fear, it also enabled the ship to function as a cohesive unit, allowing coordinated responses to the many threats that arose during long voyages. The structure was both protective and constraining, offering order and predictability in a world defined by danger and uncertainty. The psychological impact of hierarchy was profound. Sailors were constantly aware of their relative position, the expectations placed upon them, and the consequences of failure. This awareness shaped behavior, decision-making, and interactions with both superiors and peers. Fear of punishment, desire for recognition, and ambition for advancement influenced daily life, creating a complex interplay of motivation, obedience, and social dynamics. The hierarchy instilled discipline, cohesion, and a sense of purpose, while also testing resilience, patience, and emotional intelligence. Survival and success depended not only on physical skill, but also on the ability to navigate the social and organizational demands imposed by the ship's structure. Hierarchy influenced how sailors experienced hardship and reward. Privileges and duties were distributed according to rank, creating tangible differences in living conditions, workload, and access to resources. Officers enjoyed better food, more comfortable sleeping quarters, and greater autonomy, while ordinary sailors endured the most physically demanding tasks with limited comfort or recognition. Yet the system also provided a framework for progression, offering the possibility of promotion and increased status for those who demonstrated skill, courage, and loyalty. This combination of structure, expectation, and opportunity shaped the motivation, morale, and endurance of sailors throughout long and dangerous voyages. The hierarchical structure was also central to maintaining order during emergencies, such as storms, conflict, or disease outbreaks. Clear lines of authority ensured that sailors knew their responsibilities, how to respond to orders, and whom to follow. Coordination and discipline were essential to prevent chaos, injury, or the loss of the ship. The hierarchy created a chain of command that allowed rapid and organized responses to crises, enabling sailors to perform dangerous and complex tasks with precision and efficiency. Without such structure, the combined challenges of navigation, combat, labor, and survival would have been nearly impossible to manage effectively. Ultimately, the hierarchical structure aboard VOC ships was both a practical necessity and a defining feature of maritime life. It organized labor, enforced discipline, maintained social order, and facilitated survival in an environment dominated by danger and uncertainty. While it imposed constraints, fear, and inequality, it also provided clarity, direction, and opportunities for advancement. Sailors learned to navigate the demands of rank, responsibility, and obedience, balancing personal ambition with collective survival. The hierarchy shaped every interaction, decision, and action aboard the ship, influencing social dynamics, performance, and resilience. In conclusion, the hierarchical structure aboard Dutch VOC ships was an intricate and essential system that permeated all aspects of life at sea. From the captain to the low-ranked sailor, every individual had clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and privileges. The hierarchy enforced discipline, maintained order, and ensured that the ship could function efficiently in the face of storms, disease, conflict, and laborious tasks. It shaped social dynamics, psychological resilience, and the distribution of resources, influencing how sailors interacted, coped with danger, and pursued advancement. Understanding and navigating this hierarchy was essential for survival, success, and the overall cohesion of the crew. The hierarchical system aboard VOC ships was therefore not merely a social construct, but a critical mechanism that enabled sailors to endure one of history's most challenging and perilous maritime environments. Life aboard a Dutch VOC ship was arduous, but the challenges intensified dramatically upon reaching the East Indies. For sailors and officers alike, the East Indies were a region of immense wealth, opportunity, and danger. The islands were a hub of trade, producing spices, textiles, and other valuable commodities that European markets coveted. Yet the voyage to and presence in this tropical region exposed sailors to unfamiliar climates, diseases, political complexities, and logistical difficulties that tested endurance, resilience, and ingenuity. The East Indies demanded not only maritime skill, but also adaptability, strategic thinking, and an acute awareness of local customs, geography, and power structures. One of the most immediate and tangible challenges was the climate. Sailors, many of whom were accustomed to the temperate conditions of Europe, were suddenly confronted with oppressive heat, high humidity, and torrential rainfall. The heat was relentless, exacerbated by the constant labor required aboard ship. Decks became slippery with rain, sails and ropes soaked through, and the intense sun sapped energy and morale. Humidity made even simple tasks uncomfortable, and the combination of heat, sweat, and saltwater exposure led to skin irritations, infections, and exhaustion. Sailors struggled to sleep in poorly ventilated quarters, and heat-related illnesses such as heat stroke or dehydration became serious threats. The extreme climate demanded constant vigilance and adaptation, influencing how sailors performed their duties, managed resources, and preserved their health. Disease was another formidable challenge. The East Indies were rife with tropical illnesses unfamiliar to European sailors, including malaria, dysentery, and various fevers. Mosquitoes and other insects served as vectors, spreading pathogens rapidly through crews already weakened by months at sea and poor nutrition. Dysentery, spread through contaminated water and food, caused dehydration and fatigue, while malaria could strike suddenly, incapacitating even the strongest sailors. The limited medical knowledge of the time meant that treatment was rudimentary, and survival often depended on rest, basic hygiene, and luck. Disease outbreaks could decimate crews, complicate trading operations, and strain the ship's command structure, requiring officers and sailors to adapt to both immediate medical crises and long-term strategies for prevention. Navigating unfamiliar geography posed additional difficulties. The East Indies consisted of thousands of islands, reefs, and narrow straits, many of which were poorly charted or entirely unknown to European navigators. Accurate maps were rare, and sailors had to rely on experience, intuition, and guidance from local pilots when available. Mistakes in navigation could lead to shipwrecks on hidden reefs, grounding on shoals, or becoming stranded on remote islands. The constant need for precise navigation added mental strain, as even a small error could result in disaster. Officers had to train crews in reading charts, interpreting weather patterns, and executing complex maneuvers while remaining alert to hazards at all times. For ordinary sailors, vigilance, endurance, and skill were essential to ensure the ship's safety, requiring a continuous balance between effort, concentration, and physical strength. Cultural and political challenges were equally significant. The East Indies were home to diverse societies with complex social hierarchies, established trade networks, and their own systems of governance. European traders were outsiders, often viewed with suspicion or hostility. Negotiating trade agreements required careful diplomacy, understanding of local customs, and respect for social norms. Missteps could provoke conflict, jeopardize commerce, or endanger the crew. Sailors and officers had to be aware not only of military and navigational challenges, but also of the subtleties of interpersonal and intercultural interaction. Maintaining peaceful relations while asserting company interests demanded a delicate balance of tact, authority, and negotiation skills. Failure to do so could result in violent encounters, economic loss, or expulsion from critical ports. Supply and provisioning were constant logistical challenges in the East Indies. Ships required fresh water, food, and materials for repairs, yet resupplying was complicated by distance, unpredictable weather, and the limited availability of European goods. Sailors depended on local resources, trade with indigenous communities, or prearranged agreements with other European outposts. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and meat were often scarce, contributing to ongoing nutritional deficiencies and increasing vulnerability to disease. The need for careful rationing, resourcefulness, and planning became paramount, as errors in supply management could affect both the crew's health and the success of trading missions. Officers had to coordinate these efforts meticulously, ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently while maintaining discipline and morale among the crew. Language barriers and communication difficulties added another layer of challenge. European sailors rarely spoke the local languages, and interpreters were limited. Miscommunication could complicate negotiations, cause misunderstandings with local authorities, or lead to accidental offenses. Even minor mistakes in dialogue or behavior could escalate into serious conflicts, requiring quick thinking and cultural sensitivity to resolve. Sailors and officers had to rely on observation, gestures, and trial and error learning to navigate social interactions effectively. The constant need for linguistic and cultural adaptation placed an additional cognitive and emotional burden on the crew, demanding patience, flexibility, and attentiveness. Environmental hazards were also a constant threat. The tropical waters of the East Indies were home to unpredictable currents, hidden reefs, and dangerous wildlife. Storms could appear suddenly, bringing violent winds, heavy rains, and rough seas. Navigating these waters required continuous vigilance, skillful seamanship, and coordination among the crew. Ordinary sailors had to perform physically demanding tasks such as adjusting sails, managing anchors, and repairing damage, all while contending with the hazards posed by the environment. Officers had to anticipate these dangers, issue clear commands, and coordinate the crew's efforts to minimize risk. Even minor lapses in attention or execution could result in shipwreck, loss of cargo, or injury. Conflict with other European powers and local entities added another dimension of danger. The East Indies were highly contested by the Dutch, Portuguese, English, and later the French, each seeking to control lucrative trade routes and commodities. Armed skirmishes, naval battles, and disputes over trading rights were common. Sailors had to be prepared to defend the ship, its crew, and its cargo, often engaging in combat with rival traders or privateers. At the same time, local rulers and communities sometimes resisted European intrusion, leading to armed confrontations or forced negotiations. The VOC's success depended not only on maritime skill, but also on the ability to navigate complex political landscapes, demonstrating authority while maintaining strategic alliances and avoiding unnecessary conflict. Maintenance and repair of the ship were continuous challenges in the East Indies. Tropical climates accelerated wear and corrosion, while long periods at sea placed immense strain on wooden hulls, sails, and rigging. Sailors were tasked with constant maintenance work, often under difficult and dangerous conditions. Repairs were labor-intensive, requiring teamwork, skill, and endurance. Failure to maintain the ship properly could result in leaks, structural failure, or diminished maneuverability, compounding the hazards posed by storms, reefs, or conflict. Officers oversaw these efforts, coordinating labor, allocating resources, and ensuring that work was completed to standard despite fatigue, illness, and environmental stressors. Psychological and social challenges were ever present. Extended time in a foreign and often hostile environment, combined with harsh labor, disease, and the scent